At 27, I'm Elan Williams, and I never imagined I'd become a millionaire in the most tragic way imaginable. My parents were always career-focused, so my grandparents stepped in and raised me. They truly were my everything. When they died in that horrific car crash, I was utterly devastated. Then their lawyer called with news that changed absolutely everything. I was the sole heir to their $12 million estate. My family instantly switched from offering condolences to demanding I hand everything over. I refused. That very night, they kicked me out. Want to know what happened the very next day when they tried to kick me out of my own home? Hit like and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from. And prepare for a family betrayal story that will absolutely shock you. My grandparents, Harold and Martha Williams, were the anchors of my life from the moment I was born. While my parents, Thomas and Diane, were always chasing the next promotion or business opportunity, my grandparents were the ones who showed up to every school play, wiped away every tear, and celebrated every small victory. They lived in a beautiful Victorian-style home, only 20 minutes from our suburban house, and that short distance felt like a lifeline whenever I needed an escape. Growing up, I always felt like the odd one out in my immediate family. My older brother Brian, now 35, was the golden child with his sharp business mind and captivating personality. My sister Stephanie, 32, followed closely in his footsteps, becoming a successful corporate lawyer. And then there was me, the artistic dreamer who preferred sketchbooks to spreadsheets. When I was 7, my parents went on a 6-month business trip to expand their tech company internationally. Instead of hiring a nanny, as they initially suggested, my grandparents eagerly volunteered to care for me. Those 6 months blossomed into the most formative period of my childhood. Grandpa Harold, with his gentle wisdom and endless patience, taught me that true strength comes from kindness. Grandma Martha, with her vibrant creative spirit and determined nature, showed me that pursuing my passions wasn't just acceptable. It was essential. Every weekend at their house became a new adventure. Grandpa would take me fishing at the very lake where he'd proposed to Grandma 50 years earlier. He'd tell me stories about their lives, the struggles they overcame, the values that guided them. I can still hear his deep, rumbling voice saying, "Ella, remember that your worth isn't measured by what you earn, but by the good you put into this world." Grandma Martha introduced me to art. She had been a respected watercolor artist in her youth before giving it up to raise my father. She recognized my natural talent and nurtured it without any pressure. On rainy afternoons, we'd sit in her sunroom, painting landscapes and talking about everything and nothing. She was the first person who made me feel truly seen. When my parents returned from their trip, I cried for days, not wanting to leave my grandparents' house. This sparked the first of many tensions between my parents and grandparents about how I should be raised. My father would say, "You're making her soft, Dad. The world isn't a kind place." My grandfather would simply respond, "Then perhaps she will help make it kinder." As I grew older, the divide between my family members became even more pronounced. My parents pushed me toward practical career choices, dismissing my artistic pursuits as just a hobby. During family dinners, conversations always revolved around my siblings' accomplishments, while my small victories went unnoticed. If I mentioned winning an art competition or selling a commission, my father would force a tight smile and change the subject. When I turned 18, my grandparents secretly helped me apply to art school, and then paid my tuition when my parents refused. When my mother found out, she accused them of undermining their parental authority. I overheard her shouting at Grandma, "You've always tried to turn her against us. We are her parents, not you." I moved out of my parents' house immediately. After college, settling into a small apartment downtown, I built a modest career as a freelance illustrator, creating artwork for children's books and local businesses. My parents considered this a phase and regularly sent me job postings for corporate positions. Meanwhile, my grandparents visited my first art exhibition with tears of pride in their eyes, purchasing my most personal piece and hanging it prominently in their living room. Every Sunday, I would drive to their house for dinner. These meals became my sanctuary, the one place I felt completely accepted. Grandma would ask detailed questions about my latest projects, while Grandpa would clip newspaper articles about successful artists to inspire me. They created a foundation of unconditional love that sustained me through the constant disapproval from the rest of my family. The contrast between these Sunday dinners and the obligatory monthly visits to my parents' house was stark. At my parents', I felt like an outsider looking in at a family that functioned solely on ambition and achievement. Brian would discuss his latest investment success. Stephanie would talk about her high-profile cases, and my parents would beam with pride. I would sit quietly, feeling invisible and inadequate. The last time I saw my grandparents alive was 2 weeks before the accident. They had invited me over to celebrate my 27th birthday. Grandma had baked my favorite chocolate raspberry cake, and Grandpa had framed one of my childhood drawings alongside a recent commission to show how far I had come. As I was leaving, they hugged me tighter than usual. Grandma whispered, "You are the best of us, Elaine, never forget that." If only I had known those would be her final words to me. The call came on a Tuesday morning in April. I was at my drafting table, working on illustrations for a new children's book, when my phone lit up with my father's name. His voice was uncharacteristically shaky. "There has been an accident," he said flatly. "Your grandparents' car went off Mountain View Road last night. They did not make it." The world stopped spinning. My grandparents had been on their way back from celebrating their 55th wedding anniversary at the restaurant where they had their first date. According to the police report, a truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, crossing into their lane. On the winding mountain road, they died instantly on impact. The next few days passed in a blur of grief. I moved through the funeral arrangements like a ghost, unable to process that I would never hear their voices again, never feel their embracing arms. The funeral itself was a somber affair at the local church where my grandparents had attended services for decades. I noticed how my parents seemed more concerned with appearances than honoring my grandparents' memory. My mother fussed about the flower arrangements, while my father worked the room with business associates who had come to pay respects. What disturbed me most was overhearing my brother and sister discussing the estate before our grandparents were even in the ground. I caught fragments of their conversation behind a pillar at the reception. "Do you think they updated their will?" Brian asked. Stephanie responded, "Dad seems confident we'll all benefit enormously. The house alone must be worth $2 million in this market." 3 days after the funeral, we received a call from George Bennett, my grandparents' longtime friend and attorney. He requested that the entire family meet at his downtown office for the reading of the will. I remember my father looking smugly confident as we filed into the wood-paneled conference room. My mother was already mentally redecorating my grandparents' house, mentioning how she had always thought the kitchen needed updating. George Bennett was a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been my grandparents' attorney and friend for over 40 years. I had met him several times at their house during holiday gatherings. He always brought me art books and took genuine interest in my work. As we settled into the leather chairs around the conference table, he gave me a gentle, sympathetic smile before beginning the proceedings. What happened next changed everything. George cleared his throat and began reading the will. To our collective shock, he announced that my grandparents had left their entire estate to me, Elaine Williams, as the sole beneficiary. The room went deadly silent before erupting into chaos. "I will never know who looks more surprised, you or your family," George said quietly to me as my father demanded explanations. According to the will, I had inherited the Victorian house, valued at approximately $3 million, liquid assets in various accounts totaling $5 million, an investment portfolio worth another $3 million, and a valuable art collection worth at least $1 million. Additionally, there was a trust fund set up to manage the estate with George as the executor until I felt comfortable taking control. My father turned red with anger. "This cannot be right," he shouted. "They would never cut out their own son." George calmly produced documentation showing that my grandparents had updated their will just 6 months prior, with sound mind and proper witnesses. Everything was legally binding. George then handed me a sealed envelope. Your grandmother asked me to give this to you privately, but given the circumstances, perhaps you should read it now, he suggested. With trembling hands, I opened the letter and began reading my grandmother's elegant handwriting. Dearest Elaine, if you are reading this, Harold and I have left this world, hopefully together, as we have done everything in life. Please do not grieve too long. We have lived full lives, surrounded by love, especially yours. We have made the decision to leave our estate to you, not to create division, but because we believe in you and the goodness you bring to this world. Your father and siblings have been blessed with business acumen and have built comfortable lives for themselves. You, our sweet girl, see the world differently. You see beauty where others see only utility, possibility where others see limitation. This inheritance is not just money and property. It is our belief in your vision and our hope that you will use these resources to create the life that brings you joy, not the one others expect of you. We trust you completely. Know that we are proud of you not for what you achieve but for who you are. All our love, Grandma and Grandpa. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. The letter confirmed what I had always felt. My grandparents saw me. Truly saw me when everyone else was looking through me. My mother's voice cut through my emotional moment. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Clearly, they were not thinking clearly, George. As their attorney, you knew this would cause family strife. You should have counseled them better. George remained professional but firm. Harold and Martha were of completely sound mind and were very clear about their wishes. They discussed this decision at length with me, and I assure you it was made with full awareness of all implications. The meeting dissolved into accusations and demands. My brother insisted that our grandparents must have been manipulated. My sister cited her legal knowledge, threatening to contest the will. My father paced the room, alternating between bargaining with me and threatening legal action. Throughout it all, George stood as a buffer between me and their anger. As we left the office, my family closed ranks against me. In the parking lot, my father grabbed my arm. You will sign over at least half of this inheritance to the family, he insisted. It's the right thing to do. When I hesitated, my mother added, after all we've done for you, this is how you repay us. By stealing your grandparents' legacy from the rest of the family. I felt simultaneously overwhelmed by grief, confusion, and now the crushing weight of my family's expectations. George promised to help me navigate the legal aspects of the inheritance, assuring me that my grandparents' wishes were legally sound and would be protected. But I knew the legal battle would be nothing compared to the emotional warfare that had just begun with my family. The days following the will reading were a relentless barrage of manipulation tactics from my family. It started with hourly phone calls from my mother, alternating between guilt trips and angry outbursts. I shouldn't have picked up, but some part of me still craved their approval, still hoped they would eventually understand and support me. Just think about what your grandparents would really want, my mother insisted during one call. They were confused in their old age. Your father is their only child. Do you really think they meant to disinherit him completely? My father took a different approach, sending formal emails outlining how the inheritance should be divided among the family members, as if the decision had already been made. 5 days after the will reading, they organized a family dinner at their house, presenting it as a chance to talk things through reasonably. I should have known better, but I went anyway, hoping against hope that they might try to understand my position. The moment I walked through the door, I realized it was an ambush. Not only were my parents and siblings there, but also aunts, uncles, and cousins from my father's side, all looking at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. The dining room felt suffocating as my father stood at the head of the table, acting as if he were chairing a business meeting rather than a family discussion. He had actually prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Family Estate Distribution Plan. I sat silently as he outlined his proposal. 60% of the assets would go to him as the rightful son. 20% would be split between Brian and Stephanie, and I would receive 20%, which he characterized as more than generous. When I didn't immediately agree, my brother Brian leaned forward, his business negotiation face firmly in place. Elaine, you need to be practical here. You have no experience managing this kind of wealth. Without proper financial guidance, you'll lose it all within 5 years. Statistics show that most inheritance windfalls are squandered quickly. My sister Stephanie, leveraging her legal background, added, I've already spoken with several colleagues who specialize in estate
law.
They all agree that a will that completely cuts out the direct descendant in favor of a grandchild could easily be contested on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity. The pressure continued to mount as various relatives chimed in with their opinions. My Aunt Patricia, who had visited my grandparents perhaps twice in the last decade, had the audacity to say, Harold and Martha would be so disappointed to see their legacy tearing the family apart like this. Elaine, dear, the right thing to do is clear. Throughout this orchestrated attack, I noticed my cousin Sarah, just a year younger than me, watching silently from the corner with sympathy in her eyes. We had been close as children before our paths diverged. She went to medical school while I pursued art. She was the only person in the room who didn't seem to be judging me. When I finally found my voice, I spoke quietly but firmly. I understand everyone has strong feelings about this, but my grandparents made their decision clearly and legally. I intend to honor their wishes. My father's face darkened. You have always been selfish, Elaine. Always in your own little world, taking and never giving back. Do you know how much money we spent on your useless art education? And now you want to steal your grandparents' hard-earned money, too. My mother switched to tears, her favorite manipulation tactic. How can you do this to us after all the sacrifices we made for you? She conveniently forgot that it was my grandparents who had paid for my education. Things escalated when Brian stood up, pointing his finger at me. You know what people are saying, right? That you manipulated 2 elderly people, playing the devoted granddaughter while filling their heads with lies about the rest of us. It's sick, Elaine. Really sick. I felt my cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. I never asked for this. I never even knew about the will. Stephanie interjected with cold precision. Well, how convenient for you. You expect us to believe you had no idea they were planning to leave everything to you? The perfect little artist granddaughter who could do no wrong. The argument reached its breaking point when my father slammed his hand on the table. Enough! This is what's going to happen. You will call George tomorrow and tell him you want to redistribute the inheritance according to my plan. If you refuse, you are no longer welcome in this family. I looked around the table at the faces of people who were supposed to love me, unconditionally, now twisted with greed and resentment. In that moment, something broke inside me, the last thread of hope that they would ever truly accept me for who I was. I stood up slowly, my voice steadier than I felt. Grandma and Grandpa trusted me with their legacy. I will not betray that trust, not even for the sake of family peace. My mother gasped dramatically. Then you have made your choice. Don't expect any support from us when you inevitably fail. As I turned to leave, Sarah quietly stood up and handed me a folded piece of paper with her phone number. Call me if you need anything, she whispered. I was nearly to the door when my father delivered his final blow. If you walk out that door without agreeing to our terms, don't bother coming back. You're choosing money over family, and that makes, daughter of mine. I paused, turned, and looked him directly in the eyes. No, Dad, I'm choosing to respect the wishes of the 2 people who truly loved me unconditionally. Something you never managed to do. That night, I packed my essentials into my car, tears streaming down my face as I left the apartment my parents had co-signed for. I checked into a hotel, feeling utterly alone, yet strangely liberated. For the first time in my life, I was completely free from their expectations and disappointments. I cried myself to sleep, mourning not just my grandparents, but the family I had always hoped would someday accept me. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a strange sense of determination. If my family had disowned me, then I would build a new life on my own terms. I called George, who was relieved to hear from me, having received several threatening messages from my father overnight. Miss Williams, Your grandmother gave me explicit instructions to help you transition into the house whenever you felt ready," he said kindly. "Would you like me to meet you there this afternoon?" I agreed, feeling a mix of grief and anticipation at the prospect of entering my grandparents' home as its new owner. When I pulled into the familiar circular driveway, the Victorian house looked exactly as it always had, with its gingerbread trim and wraparound porch. Yet, everything felt different. The hanging baskets of ferns my grandmother had lovingly tended were beginning to wilt. The porch swing where my grandfather had told me countless stories sat motionless in the spring breeze. George was waiting on the porch, a set of keys and a thick folder in his hands. As he unlocked the door, he explained, "Your grandparents left detailed instructions about everything in the house." Martha was nothing if not organized. He handed me the keys with a gentle smile. "Welcome home, Elaine. They would be so happy to know you are here." Stepping over the threshold without my grandparents greeting me felt wrong, like entering a church after services had ended. The house smelled the same, a mixture of lemon polish, old books, and the lingering scent of my grandmother's rose perfume. I ran my fingers along the familiar mahogany banister, remembering how I used to slide down it as a child while my grandfather pretended not to notice. George showed me to the study where several boxes of documents were neatly stacked on the large oak desk. "These contain all the financial records, property deeds, and investment information," he explained. "Also, your grandmother kept extensive journals and correspondence that she specifically wanted you to have. I've taken the liberty of having a security system installed given your father's recent threats." After George left, promising to return the next day to go over more details, I found myself alone in the house, filled with memories. Rather than unpacking my meager belongings, I was drawn to the boxes of my grandmother's journals. The oldest dated back to before my father was born, bound in faded leather with her maiden name embossed on the cover. As I began reading, a very different picture of my family emerged. I discovered that my grandparents had not always been wealthy. They had built their fortune through decades of smart investments and hard work. My grandfather had started as a junior attorney at a small firm before eventually founding his own successful practice. My grandmother had been a talented artist who later became a respected art dealer with an eye for undiscovered talent. Most shocking was learning that they had financially supported my parents in the early years of their marriage. When my father wanted to start his tech company, my grandparents had provided the initial capital, nearly $1 million. According to my grandmother's records, this loan had never been repaid, despite my parents' eventual success. Instead, as their company grew, my parents had become increasingly distant, visiting only when they needed something. Another journal from when I was around 10 years old detailed my grandmother's concerns about how my parents were treating me. She wrote, "Thomas and Diane seemed to have no patience for Elaine's gentle spirit. They'd push the older children toward achievement at any cost, and I fear they see Elaine's artistic nature as a defect rather than a gift. Harold and I have discussed taking a more active role in her upbringing, even if it causes tension with Thomas." In a box of correspondence, I found letters between my grandfather and my father, spanning 2 decades. The early letters were warm and supportive, but over time, my father's tone became increasingly demanding and entitled. In one particularly disturbing letter dated just 5 years ago, my father had actually suggested that my grandparents should sell their house and move into a retirement community, offering to help them manage the resulting funds. Reading between the lines, it was clear he had been trying to get control of their assets even then. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the study, I discovered a hidden compartment in my grandfather's desk. Inside was a USB drive labeled Family Business and a handwritten note saying for Elaine, if necessary. I plugged it into my laptop and found dozens of folders containing financial records, emails, and legal documents. Among them was evidence that my brother Brian had approached my grandfather 3 years ago, asking for a $2 million investment in a business venture. My grandfather had apparently done his due diligence and discovered the venture was highly questionable, possibly fraudulent. He had declined to invest, and Brian had never mentioned it to the rest of the family. I was so absorbed in these revelations that I nearly jumped out of my skin when the doorbell rang. My heart racing, I approached the front door cautiously, half expecting to find my angry family on the porch. Instead, I was greeted by an elderly man in overalls, with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Miss Elaine, I'm Frank, your grandparents' gardener for the past 30 years. I heard you had moved in and wanted to pay my respects. I've been keeping an eye on the gardens since they passed. Your grandmother wouldn't have wanted her roses to suffer." I invited Frank in for tea, and over the next hour, he shared stories about my grandparents that I had never heard. How my grandfather had paid for Frank's daughter's college education when his wife fell ill and medical bills depleted their savings. How my grandmother had visited Frank's wife in the hospital every day for 3 months, bringing fresh flowers and home-cooked meals. The picture he painted was consistent with the grandparents I knew, loving, generous, and principled. When you need to make a difficult decision, your grandfather always said to ask yourself what kind of person you want to be when you look back on your life. Not what's easiest in the moment, Frank told me as he was leaving. They were good people, Miss Elaine, the best I ever knew. That night, I explored more of the house, seeing it through new eyes. In what had been my grandmother's art studio, I discovered dozens of my childhood drawings and paintings carefully preserved in archival sleeves. She had kept everything from my first clumsy crayon scribbles to my recent professional work. Beside them was a half-finished painting of her own, a portrait of me that she must have been working on before she died. In my grandfather's library, I found books on art investment and nonprofit management, with recent bookmarks and notes in the margins. It seemed they had been researching ways to help me establish myself as an artist long before they updated their will. As I continued exploring, I came across photos of my grandparents with prominent figures in the art world, at charity galas and receiving community service awards. I realized how little I actually knew about their lives outside of their relationship with me. They had been respected community leaders who used their wealth to help others quietly and without recognition. By midnight, sitting in my grandmother's garden room surrounded by her beloved plants, I made a decision. I would use this inheritance exactly as they had intended, not just to secure my own future, but to continue their legacy of quiet generosity. I would establish a foundation in their name to support young artists who, like me, needed someone to believe in them when their own families didn't. As I finally went to bed in the guest room, unable to bring myself to use my grandparents' bedroom yet, I felt their presence all around me. For the first time since their death, I slept peacefully, knowing I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was awakened the next morning by my phone buzzing with text messages. My sister Stephanie had sent a series of increasingly threatening messages. "You have 24 hours to reconsider. Dad has hired Vincent Morgan." My stomach dropped. Vincent Morgan was one of the most aggressive estate attorneys in the state, known for his ruthless tactics and high success rate in contesting wills. More messages followed from various family members, ranging from guilt-inducing pleas to outright threats. My aunt wrote, "Your grandparents are rolling in their graves seeing how you've torn this family apart." My brother sent, "Hope you're enjoying playing house in a property that should belong to all of us. Dad is going to make sure you regret this." I called George immediately, who reassured me that the will was solid but suggested we meet that afternoon to discuss a strategy. "You're not alone in this, Elaine. Your grandparents anticipated potential challenges and took extensive precautions." Later that morning, as I was sorting through more of my grandparents' papers, the doorbell rang. A young woman with a friendly smile introduced herself as Lily Andrews, claiming to be an old friend of mine from art school. I had no recollection of ever meeting her, but she spoke convincingly about classes and professors, making me doubt my own memory. She asked for a tour of the house, commenting extensively on the value of various antiques and art pieces. Her questions became increasingly focused on whether I planned to sell anything and if I lived alone in the big house. Something about her felt off, but I couldn't place why. When she went to the bathroom, I noticed her taking photos of the hallway and rooms she passed. As she was leaving, she hugged me awkwardly and said, "It was so great catching up. One might bring some other classmates by soon." We should totally hang out more often. A chill ran down my spine as I watched her get into a car where someone was waiting in the driver's seat. The car drove past the house twice more that afternoon. My suspicions were confirmed when my cousin Sarah called me. Elaine, I need to warn you. They sent someone to spy on you. Some girl they hired to pretend she knows you from school. They're trying to gather evidence that you're living extravagantly or mismanaging the estate. My blood ran cold. So I hadn't been paranoid. After all, Sarah continued, I can't believe how they're behaving. This isn't about fairness, it's about control. Uncle Thomas has always expected everyone to fall in line with his plans. She paused before adding, I wanted you to know I'm on your side. What your grandparents did was their choice, and the way the family is treating you is wrong. Her support meant more than she could know. For the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone against my family. We agreed to meet for coffee soon, away from the prying eyes of our relatives. Later that afternoon, I met with George at his office to discuss the legal threats. He suggested bringing in additional legal support and recommended a younger attorney named Michael Richardson, who specialized in contested wills. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, a man around my age with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. As George explained my situation, Michael took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When George mentioned my grandparents' names, Michael looked up with sudden recognition.
Harold and Martha Williams? He asked.
Mr. Williams gave me my first internship in law school. He was an incredible mentor to me. I had no idea he had passed. I'm so sorry for your loss. The coincidence felt like more than chance, like my grandfather was still looking out for me somehow. Michael explained that he had worked under my grandfather for a summer 5 years ago and had kept in touch occasionally since then. This personal connection made me trust him immediately in a way I might not have trusted another lawyer. Michael was straightforward about what we were facing. Your father has significant resources and connections. Vincent Morgan has a reputation for using aggressive tactics, including trying to overwhelm beneficiaries with paperwork and legal costs until they agree to settle. The good news is that your grandparents will appear to be exceptionally well-crafted. The fact that they updated it recently with proper witnesses and medical verification of their mental capacity strengthens our position considerably. We spent hours going through every potential legal challenge my family might bring and preparing counterarguments. By the time we finished, it was nearly dark, and Michael offered to follow me home to ensure I arrived safely, concerned about the surveillance Sarah had warned me about. As we pulled into the driveway, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood freeze. My father's car was parked on the street, along with my brother's SUV and 2 vehicles I didn't recognize. Light spilled from the windows of my grandparents' house, and I could see figures moving inside. Michael immediately called the police while I sat paralyzed with shock. How had they gotten in? Then I remembered the spare key my grandmother kept hidden in the garden, a key I hadn't thought to relocate. Before the police arrived, Michael and I watched from my car as my father, brother, sister, and 2 men in suits I didn't recognize carried boxes and small pieces of furniture out to their vehicles. They were literally looting the house while I sat watching. When the police finally arrived, my father greeted them with the confident smile he reserved for authority figures. Officer, glad you're here. My daughter has been experiencing some mental health issues since my parents passed away. We're just collecting some family heirlooms that belong to us before she can damage or sell them. The 2 officers looked uncertainly. Between my father, the respectable businessman in an expensive suit, and me, the distraught-looking young woman who had been crying in her car. For a moment I feared they would believe him over me. Then Michael stepped forward, introducing himself as my attorney. Officers, this house and everything in it legally belongs to Miss Williams, as the sole beneficiary of Harold and Martha Williams' estate. These individuals are trespassing and attempting to remove property that is not theirs, my father scoffed. This is a family matter. My parents clearly did not intend to disinherit their only son. We have filed to contest the will, and until that's resolved, these items should remain in the family's possession, not just with her. I was about to respond when a black town car pulled into the driveway. George Bennett emerged, followed by a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who carried himself with unmistakable authority. As they approached, my father's confident expression faltered slightly. "I believe that's quite enough, Thomas," George said firmly. "Officers, I am George Bennett, executor of the Williams estate and the family's attorney for over 40 years. This is James Parker, managing partner at Parker Goldman and Associates." The name hit like a thunderclap. Parker Goldman and Associates was the most prestigious law firm in the state. James Parker was not just any attorney. He was a legal legend, whose name appeared in law textbooks. Mr. Parker surveyed the scene with calm disapproval. "Officers, I can provide you with all the necessary documentation proving Miss Williams' legal ownership of this property and its contents. These individuals," he gestured toward my family, "have no legal right to be here or to remove anything without the owner's permission." The officers, clearly recognizing both George and Mr. Parker, immediately became more professional.
They
Asked to see the will and property documents, which George promptly provided. After reviewing them, they turned to my father and firmly instructed him and the others to return everything they had taken and leave the premises immediately. My father's face contorted with rage, but he knew better than to argue with police officers in front of James Parker. As they reluctantly carried the items back inside, I noticed Mr. Parker watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and determination. Once my family had been escorted off the property and the police had taken statements about the break-in, Mr. Parker approached me. "Miss Williams, I apologize for not introducing myself properly earlier. I was a close friend of your grandparents for over 30 years. I had planned to contact you tomorrow, but George called me when he learned of tonight's situation. I was confused. Why would such an important attorney be involved in my case?" As if reading my mind, Mr. Parker continued, "Your grandfather and I went to law school together. We remained close throughout our careers. In fact," he nodded with a gentle smile, "I am your godfather, Elaine, though I suspect your parents never mentioned that fact." The revelation that James Parker was my godfather left me speechless. Here was yet another connection to my grandparents that my parents had deliberately kept from me. Mr. Parker, my godfather, explained that he had stayed in touch with my grandparents over the years but had respected their wishes to keep a distance after my father made it clear he wanted no interference from his parents' friends. We all moved into the living room where George and Mr. Parker explained the full situation. "Your grandparents came to me 6 months ago with concerns about your father's behavior," Mr. Parker said. "They had discovered some troubling information and wanted legal advice about protecting their assets, not just for their own security but to ensure you would be provided for." From his briefcase, he withdrew a folder containing documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The first was a series of loan agreements between my grandparents and my parents, totaling over $3 million over 20 years. None of these loans had been repaid despite my parents' considerable financial success. There was evidence that your father attempted to access your grandparents' accounts without authorization on at least 2 occasions, George added gently. They changed banks and security measures as a result. Even more disturbing were the financial records showing that my brother Brian had misappropriated funds from the family business where he served as CFO. My grandfather, who had maintained a small ownership stake in the company, had discovered the discrepancies during a routine review of the annual reports. Rather than expose his grandson, he had privately confronted Brian and forced him to return the money, approximately $800,000, without informing the board or other executives. Mr. Parker continued, "Your sister Stephanie approached your grandparents last year about liquidating part of their art collection to invest in her husband's startup. When they declined, she began researching how to challenge mental competency for elderly relatives. We have copies of her browser history from their computer when she visited them last Christmas. She used their home office computer and didn't clear the history. The most shocking revelation came in the form of a recorded conversation. Your grandfather had legitimate concerns about your father's intentions," Mr. Parker explained as he set up his laptop. With my legal advice, he took the precaution of recording this conversation during their last family meeting. The recording began to play, and I heard my father's voice clearly. Mom, Dad, you're both getting older. It's time to think about simplifying your lives. Why not sell this big house? I can help you manage the proceeds, invest them properly for your retirement. You don't need all this space or the hassle of maintenance. My grandmother's voice firm despite her age. We're perfectly capable of managing our own affairs, Thomas. This house is our home, and we intend to stay here. Then my father, his tone sharpening. Look, I'm trying to help you. You're both in your 80s. Who knows how much longer you'll be able to make sound decisions? Wouldn't it be better to let me handle things while you can still have input, rather than waiting until you're incapacitated? The conversation continued, growing increasingly tense as my father pushed and my grandparents resisted. Then came the most damning moment when my father thought they couldn't hear him. The recording captured him in the hallway speaking to my mother. They're getting stubborn in their old age. We need to move faster before they change their will again. I'm not letting them give everything to Elaine just because she kisses up to them. That money should stay in the main family line. I sat stunned as the recording ended. Mr. Parker looked at me sympathetically. Your grandparents loved your father, but they weren't blind to his flaws. They were deeply concerned about his attitude toward their estate and his treatment of you. That's why they took steps to protect you and their legacy. Just as we were processing this information, the doorbell rang again. Michael checked the security camera installed by George and announced, "It's the police again, and your family is back." When we opened the door, my father stood there with a smug expression, flanked by my mother, Brian, and Stephanie. Behind them were two police officers and a woman who introduced herself as a social worker from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report of elder financial abuse, the female officer stated professionally. The complaint alleges that Miss Elaine Williams manipulated her elderly grandparents into changing their will shortly before their deaths, cutting out the rest of the family. My father stepped forward, handing the officer what appeared to be a formal complaint. We have evidence that my daughter took advantage of my parents' declining mental state to secure their fortune for herself. Given her history of financial instability and her close relationship with their lawyer, he glared at George. We believe a full investigation is warranted. The social worker explained that they needed to conduct an assessment based on the serious allegations. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. My family had moved from threats to action, and they were playing to win. Before I could respond, James Parker stepped forward, introducing himself to the officers with quiet authority. Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I need to make you aware of several facts. First, he gestured to his briefcase. I have comprehensive medical evaluations from 3 separate physicians, confirming Harold and Martha Williams were of sound mind when they updated their will 6 months ago. The officers looked uncertain, clearly not expecting to encounter someone of Mr. Parker's stature. He continued, more pertinently, I have documentation indicating that Thomas Williams and his children have engaged in concerning financial behaviors that prompted the deceased to change their wills, specifically to protect their assets. My father's face darkened. This is ridiculous. Who even are you to make these accusations? Mr. Parker's expression remained calm. I am James Parker, managing partner at Parker Goldman and Associates. I was Harold Williams' closest friend for over 50 years and have served as special counsel to their estate planning for the past decade. More importantly, I am Elaine's godfather. The officers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing his name and reputation. Mr. Parker continued. I believe you should also be aware that we have filed a police report regarding the unauthorized entry and attempted removal of property from this house earlier this evening. I believe your colleagues responded to that call. He then addressed my father directly, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. Thomas, I have here. He pulled out another folder. Documentation of the $3 million your parents loaned you over the years, which you never repaid despite your financial success. I also have evidence of your attempts to access their accounts without authorization, which constitutes attempted financial elder abuse. My father's face paled. That's not what happened. They wanted to help me with the business. It was a gift, not a loan. Mr. Parker raised an eyebrow. The signed loan documents with repayment terms would suggest otherwise. He turned to my brother. And Brian, I have here the documentation of the $800,000 you misappropriated from the company funds, which your grandfather discovered and forced you to quietly return. I believe the statute of limitations hasn't expired on that particular offense. Brian's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I don't know what you're talking about, he finally stammered. The social worker and police officers were. Now looking at my family with growing suspicion, Mr. Parker addressed my sister next. Stephanie, as an attorney, I'm sure you're aware that researching how to challenge an elderly person's mental competency for the explicit purpose of gaining control of their assets could be construed as conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Your digital footprint on your grandparents' computer was quite extensive. As my family stood speechless, a car pulled up and to my surprise, my cousin Sarah stepped out. She walked nervously to the porch, carrying a laptop. I have something you should hear, she said, looking directly at the officers. When Uncle Thomas was at our house last week planning this, he didn't know I was recording on my computer. She opened her laptop and played an audio file. My father's voice came through clearly. Once we get control of the estate, we'll sell the art collection immediately. Stephanie, your husband's friend at the gallery, can help move it quickly, under market value if necessary. We need liquid assets before that little ingrate can get her hands on anything substantial. The important thing is to make Elaine look unstable and manipulative to the authorities. The officers and social worker listened with professional neutrality, but their body language had shifted. One officer took Sarah aside to ask additional questions while the other turned to my father. Sir, we're going to need you and your family to come down to the station to answer some questions about these allegations. My father's face contorted with fury. This is all a setup. They're manipulating you just like they manipulated my parents. As the situation escalated, more police arrived, called by the original officers. While they were questioning everyone, I stood to the side with Michael, trying to process the rapid turn of events. He placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. It's going to be okay, Elaine. The truth is coming out. The confrontation reached its climax when one officer received confirmation over the radio that the documents my father had presented as evidence had been falsified. Forensic analysis of the dates showed they had been created just days ago, not months before my grandparents' deaths as claimed. That was the final straw. My father, brother, and sister were escorted to separate police cars for further questioning downtown. My mother, left standing alone on the porch, looked smaller and older than I had ever seen her. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something I had never seen before: genuine fear. Not fear of consequences, but fear of losing the carefully constructed image she had maintained for decades. I want to hate you, she said quietly, but I cannot. You have destroyed everything we built. I could have said many things in that moment, about how they had never truly seen me, about how they had tried to steal what my grandparents had lovingly left me, about the years of emotional neglect. Instead, I simply said, "No, Mom, you did that yourselves." As she walked away to her car, Sarah approached me hesitantly. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner," she said. "They've always been like this, haven't they? Calculating every situation for maximum benefit." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. "Thank you for coming forward." "That took real courage," Sarah smiled sadly. "Your grandparents were always kind to me too. They deserved better than this, and so did you." As the police cars drove away and the chaos subsided, I stood on the porch of my grandparents' home, our home now surrounded by the unlikely alliance that had formed to protect me. George, my grandparents' trusted attorney. Michael, the young lawyer my grandfather had mentored. James Parker, my rediscovered godfather. And Sarah, the cousin who had found her own courage. For the first time since learning of my inheritance, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth had come to light, and with it, a chance to truly honor my grandparents' legacy, without the shadow of my family's greed hanging over me. 6 months passed like a dream. The criminal investigation into my father and brother's financial improprieties resulted in charges that were still working their way through the legal system. My sister avoided criminal charges but faced an ethics investigation from the Bar Association. My parents separated shortly after the incident, with my mother moving to Florida to live with her sister. The beautiful Victorian house that had once been my grandparents' sanctuary became mine in more than just legal terms. I renovated the ground floor to create a community art space where local artists could exhibit their work without the prohibitive fees of commercial galleries. The sunroom where my grandmother had taught me to paint became a studio where I offered free art classes to children from low-income neighborhoods. With James Parker's guidance, I established the Harold and Martha Williams Foundation, dedicated to providing scholarships and grants to young artists struggling to pursue their passion against financial or family obstacles. The foundation's first fundraising gala, held in the garden where my grandfather had taught me about resilience and integrity, raised over $1 million. Michael Richardson, who had stood by me during the darkest moments, became a trusted friend, and eventually something more. Our shared connection to my grandfather created a foundation of understanding that blossomed into love. He understood my need to move slowly, to heal from the family trauma before fully opening my heart. My cousin Sarah, inspired by the events and seeking her own independence, accepted my invitation to move into the east wing of the house. She had always wanted to pursue music, but had been pushed into medicine by her parents. Now at 26 she was starting over, taking music classes and helping me with the foundation. Her presence filled the large house with laughter and harmony. News about my family came in fragments. My father's company suffered after the scandal broke, with several board members distancing themselves from him. Brian faced embezzlement charges from his own company once they conducted a thorough audit. Stephanie and her husband moved to another state, starting over where their reputation hadn't been tarnished. Some relatives who had initially sided with my parents reached out apologetically, claiming they hadn't understood the full situation. I was civil but cautious, setting clear boundaries while leaving the door open for genuine reconciliation. A few, like my mother's younger brother, who had always been kind to me, became regular visitors to the art center. As autumn turned the maple trees in the garden to gold and crimson, I discovered another treasure in my grandfather's study, a journal he had kept, specifically about their wealth and its origins. The story was fascinating and humbling. My great-grandfather had been a carpenter who saved a prominent businessman from a hotel fire in 1930. The grateful businessman had helped him invest his modest savings wisely, setting in motion the family fortune. My grandfather had written, "Wealth that comes through good fortune carries a responsibility. We are not owners but stewards charged with using these resources to create more good in the world." This perspective shifted my thinking about the inheritance. It wasn't mine to hoard, but mine to direct toward positive change. On a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after my grandparents' passing, I hosted a memorial gathering in their honor. The house was filled with people whose lives they had touched, many I had never met before, their former colleagues, friends from volunteer organizations, artists my grandmother had mentored, clients my grandfather had helped pro bono.
Each
person had a story about their kindness, integrity, or generosity. Frank the gardener brought a specially cultivated rose bush he had named Martha's Grace. With delicate pink blooms that matched my grandmother's favorite lipstick color, he planted it in the center of the garden as everyone watched in respectful silence. James Parker gave a moving speech about his 50-year friendship with my grandfather, sharing stories I had never heard about their law school days and early careers. When he spoke about my grandmother's fierce intelligence and artistic eye, I felt her presence so strongly I could almost smell her rose perfume. Near the end of the evening, as guests mingled around the garden, a car pulled up in the driveway. My mother stepped out, looking hesitant and much older than when I had last seen her. She approached slowly, clearly unsure of her welcome. I met her halfway down the garden path. We stood in awkward silence before she finally spoke. "Your grandparents would be proud of what you've done here." She gestured toward the house and the gathering. "They always saw something in you that I was too blind to see." The apology was imperfect, incomplete, but it was a beginning. I didn't rush to forgive or forget, but I invited her to join the memorial. Small steps on a long road to potential healing. As the last guest departed and I sat alone on the porch swing that had been my grandfather's favorite spot, I reflected on the journey of the past year. I had lost my beloved grandparents but found my voice and purpose. I had lost the family I was born into but created a new one based on genuine connection rather than obligation. The inheritance had never really been about the money or property. It was about faith in me and my potential. A faith my grandparents had nurtured from the beginning. They had seen me clearly when others looked past me, valued me for exactly who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. The true legacy they left was not measured in dollars, but in the values they instilled: integrity, compassion, creativity, and the courage to stand firm in your convictions, even when standing alone. These were the real treasures, ones that could never be spent or stolen. As I swayed gently on the porch swing under a canopy of stars, I felt a profound sense of peace. The path forward was clear, not easy, but clear. I would honor my grandparents not by clinging to their possessions, but by embodying their values and extending their generosity into the future. Have you ever had someone who believed in you when no one else did? Someone who saw your potential, even when you couldn't see it yourself? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, please subscribe to my channel for more real-life experiences. Like and share if you found value in this story. I am grateful to each of you for listening, and I hope you remember that family isn't always defined by blood but by who truly sees and accepts you for who you are. Thank you for being part of my healing journey. And I wish you the courage to honor your own truth, whatever that may be.